So a while ago I made a video called Don't Use a Line of Action, and even though a line of action can be a brilliant tool, I stand by everything I said in the video. What we're going to do now is I'm going to explain what a line of action is quickly, then I'll explain very quickly why it can go wrong when not to use it, and then we'll get into how to use it properly and how it can become so powerful for your figures, especially when you're drawing figures to tell a story, for an illustration, when you want your image to have a narrative to it. A line of action is a line that summarizes a pose's movement and direction. So for example, here, we could summarize this pose with this forward-leaning diagonal line, because this pose is all about this driving forwards, very dynamic. And so this line really captures a lot of that. And then when you're doing your drawing of this, you could build the forms onto this diagonal and make sure that you're getting that overall forward lean and you capture a lot of the movement and energy. You could also capture this with that diagonal, but also give it an overall curve, which could even add to the dynamism of this pose. And what you could then do if you want, if you're trying to draw this and you're really trying to lean into the movement and that forward drive and the energy, is when you do your sketch, you could go, well, this is what the pose is all about. I'm going to exaggerate this, lean it forwards even more. And then when you come to do your sketch, you can build the forms onto this exaggerated line of action. And now the pose is going to have this extra power and energy to it because you've exaggerated that forward drive. So the line of action is really, really powerful. It makes sure that the overall shape of your drawing has this direction to it. You can see in these classic paintings that the poses have a clear direction to them, and that's part of the composition. You know, it guides the viewer's eye through the scene, but it also makes the role of each character really, really clear. So the line of action is very powerful for storytelling, for illustration, and for paintings like these that have a kind of story to them. So why then do I say don't use a line of action, even though it's pretty awesome? Because most artists, 99%, have a strong tendency to straighten out poses, to make them less dramatic, less dynamic. So a pose like this, where, you know, the head is pushed across, it's on this strong diagonal, the rib cage is on this strong diagonal too, and it's leaning back. We've got this squash and this stretch and all these dynamic things happening. People will very often draw it more like this, right? With the head more straight, the squash and stretch, the lean back of the rib cage, everything straightened out a bit, everything reduced. So you would think maybe actually the line of action would help with that, but most of the time it does the opposite from what I've seen, okay? The reason for that is because the line of action is pretty vague. So if we really think about, you know, if we just think about the sort of heart of the head to rib cage to pelvis and the sort of strong curvature that we might get for a line of action, very often it doesn't really correspond to anything specific, but we want to get this strong overall curvature. Very often, because it's kind of vague and we have this tendency to want to straighten it out, people will straighten out that line of action. So right from the start, starting to get a bit stiff with it, right? But let's say you do the line of action like this. Really nice, big, strong curve. So we're off to a great start, right? The pose is going to end up dramatic and dynamic. But this, again, is vague. It's not clear what it corresponds to. It's not specific. So you can put the forms onto it in all kinds of different ways, and we're pulled to be conservative. So what ends up happening is that people will put the forms onto this line of action in a really straight way that loses the squash and stretch. So even though the drawing started with a line of action, it gets really, really stiff. So what I generally recommend is to think about what's happening in the form of the head, which is a specific thing we can see, then link that up to the rib cage and how that's leaning back and how that's rotated, and we can see the rib cage, the landmarks. I'm not going to go into this whole process, but I'll put the tutorials below because this video isn't about this. And then push how the hips are coming across, get that squash and stretch. It's more specific. You can check specific landmarks and angles with this process and make sure you capture that dynamism. Okay, so leaving that aside, when should we then use this powerful tool of the line of action? In my opinion, once you're confident with this, with seeing and understanding the forms, and once you've trained yourself out of that straightening mentality and you don't do it anymore, right? Then the line of action becomes such a powerful tool for making sure you give poses this strong direction. You can exaggerate that direction. You can add more movement and dynamism with this powerful tool. And then you can make sure that, let's say you have a composition, you need the silhouette, the shape that each figure is creating to have these directions to tell the story and to guide the viewer's eye. Then the line of action, once you've got to this stage of creating art and creating artwork, then the line of action is going to be super powerful. So let's see it in action now. So let's go back to this pose, which I drew with the line of action. Now, when we look at this pose, if I was just to draw it really, really accurately, then, I'm going to get the head and then the rib cage and then the hips, and they're going along this curve. But then actually the thigh comes off that curve, right? And so it would be cooler if this photo was taken a split second later when the thigh was coming back like this and everything is moving along that line. Then the whole shape of this pose is going to be going in this forward direction that we need it to, whereas this thigh is like almost vertical, right? So because I'm using a line of action here and I'm confident with my figure drawing generally, I'm able to move things around, I'm going to be able to change this pose to fit the line of action better. In other words, this reference is becoming truly just a reference. I'm not just copying it down. I'm not just trying to match it. I'm creating a new pose almost, which suits the line of action that I want for the story that I want to tell. And the story I want to tell is really powerful forward drive, forward movement. So I can then build my head form, rib cage, egg form, hips, and then the thigh off of that. So hopefully you can see that what I get at the end of the sketch, it's just a quick sketch, what I get at the end of the sketch is a really dynamic pose with that forward drive and movement to it. All right, I did another one straight after, a little bit more of a subtle pose, but this pose also has a lot of forward lean to it, and then a little bit of a twist of the head. It's less about super powerful forward drive, but I wanted to make sure that I got that overall forward leaning and forward propulsion that he's got going on. So I started with a line of action and then I build the forms onto it. And then continuing the practice session, I found a sort of C-shaped curve to the line of action for this pose. The line of action, there isn't really a right answer, so you could do it differently. You might see it like this or something. But I went with that. I decided to do it first in charcoal pencil, then later, let me skip forward, I did it with a pen and marker pen, and this time decided to exaggerate the line of action. So if this was the shape I was seeing, I decided to make that kind of fold at the hips, the squash. More exaggerated, lean in forward more. It's kind of straightforward to do that just by exaggerating the line of action, then building the forms off of that. I did the American football player in pen and ink as well, trying to add that forward movement and drive. And then finally, I wanted to show you this one with the lady walking along with the umbrella, because it's not, maybe not quite as obvious of a big dynamic pose, but actually it also has this forward movement to it, right? From the walking. So this is roughly speaking, this orange line is roughly speaking the line of action I saw, but I leaned into it a bit, exaggerated it a little bit for this sketch. So, loads of fun with the line of action. Now, I haven't done line of action practice for a while, and what reminded me of the brilliant power of the line of action was a workshop we did with Jared Cullum, who's my favorite illustrator, and he said how he draws figures for storytelling, for illustration, and the line of action was central to that. So that workshop he did for our study group. I also did these demos for our study group. Our study group is where we focus on specific techniques and how we're going to use them to our advantage, how we're going to use them to make figure drawing easier. Because believe it or not, all these ideas and techniques are here to help, not to make things harder and more confusing, but to be tools to make it all easier to do. So if you want to learn how to simplify the forms of the figure first, simplify the head, rib cage, pelvis, which I think is much more beneficial as a starting point than the line of action. But then later, when you get more confident, build your gesture skills and then build your ability to draw with the line of action, come and join our study group, because we cover everything in the most concise way possible. No wasting time, no sitting through, 8-hour-long demos when you don't have time to do that. Everything is really to the point and focused on the exercises that are going to make the most difference. We've got guest instructors like Jared, and we've got a core curriculum for figures that I teach in there. And then you get one-to-one feedback because you need feedback specifically on your drawings. That is so powerful and helpful. Now, for right now, that video that I made before about the line of action is up on the screen, so you might want to check it out, because in there I talk about if you're not ready yet for that line of action, that approach, that rib cage pelvis head approach, that you should try first. So go and check that out.